In March 2006, a cruise ship sailing between Grand Cayman and Montego Bay had a fire break out on a cabin balcony at 3 in the morning, and within minutes, high winds turned it into a wall of flame, climbing 3 decks at once. The ship had one of the most advanced fire suppression systems in the industry installed at the time, and someone still died from the smoke before anyone got close to putting it out. That contradiction is exactly what we're breaking down today, what actually happens, system by system, when a fire starts on a vessel that's sometimes days from the nearest port, with no fire department to call. And by the end of this, you'll understand something most passengers never think about. On a cruise ship, the fire isn't usually what kills people. The smoke almost always gets there first. Here's the detail that should genuinely change how you think about this. That ship's suppression system worked exactly as designed. It just wasn't required to cover the one place the fire actually started. Balcony areas, at the time, fell outside the same fire protection standards required for the interior of the ship. No fixed detection, no fixed suppression, because regulators had classified them as external space rather than living space. We'll come back to exactly how that single regulatory gap changed international maritime law within 2 years. But first, you need to understand why a fire at sea is treated as a fundamentally different problem than a fire on land. Here's what makes this genuinely difficult to reason about. A cruise ship carries 6,000 to 9,000 passengers, sails for a week or more, and can be hundreds of miles from the nearest coastline at any given moment. If a fire breaks out in a building on land, you call the fire department, and they arrive in minutes. At sea, there is no external fire department. The ship's own crew is the fire department, permanently, for the entire duration of the voyage. So the real question isn't whether cruise ships can catch fire. They're floating structures full of electrical systems, fuel, kitchens, and thousands of people's belongings. Of course they can. The question is what system has to exist on board so that a fire starting in one place doesn't become a fire that consumes the entire vessel before anyone from outside can possibly help. Let's put the actual scale of this in context. A large cruise ship can be divided into more than a dozen separate fire zones, called main vertical zones under international maritime law, each one enclosed by fire-rated steel bulkheads and decks specifically designed to contain a fire within that single zone for a defined period, often rated for 60 minutes or more of direct fire exposure before failure. Every one of these ships carries dedicated crew members trained specifically in firefighting, separate from their normal hospitality or technical roles, and every crew member, regardless of department, participates in mandatory fire drills before the ship ever leaves port. Fixed smoke detectors and fire suppression systems, often advanced water mist technology rather than traditional sprinklers, cover the vast majority of interior spaces, corridors, cabins, engine rooms, galleys. None of this is generic safety theater. Every element traces back to a real incident that revealed exactly where the previous version of the system fell short. Most people assume that if a fire starts anywhere on a cruise ship, the entire vessel goes into a full evacuation, alarms blaring, everyone rushing to lifeboats, the ship's voyage effectively over. That assumption is wrong, and it's actually the opposite of how the system is designed to respond. Evacuating thousands of passengers is treated as close to a last resort, not a first response. Because moving that many people into lifeboats introduces its own serious risks, especially if the ship is still fully capable of containing the fire on its own. The actual design goal is containment first. Keep the fire inside its zone of origin, extinguish it there, and never let it reach the point where evacuation becomes the only option. Here's how that containment system actually works in practice. The moment a fire is detected, either by a passenger, crew member, or one of the ship's fixed detectors, an alarm is transmitted directly to the ship's central fire control station, typically staffed continuously and monitored by an officer specifically responsible for fire safety. Fire doors throughout the affected zone close automatically. Some ships have well over 1,000 of these doors, sealing the fire's boundary before a single crew member even arrives on scene. The ship's dedicated firefighting teams, organized in the same way a shore-based fire department would be, with designated roles, breathing apparatus, and specific zone assignments, are dispatched immediately. Meanwhile, ventilation to the affected area is shut down or reversed, specifically to stop feeding oxygen to the fire and to control the direction smoke travels through the ship. Here's the deeper engineering logic connecting all of this. The steel bulkheads separating fire zones aren't just solid metal. They're insulated to a specific fire resistance rating, commonly referred to as A-class divisions, meaning they're certified to block both flame and a defined amount of heat transfer for 30 to 60 minutes, depending on classification, enough time, in theory, for the ship's own crew to arrive and begin active suppression before the fire can spread structurally into the next zone. This is the same underlying principle as the ship's watertight compartments we've covered in other videos. Contain the failure at its source, buy time, and let a trained response team do the rest, rather than relying on the fire simply burning out on its own. Fixed water mist suppression systems, the same category of technology installed on that 2006 vessel, work by releasing extremely fine water droplets that absorb heat far more efficiently than a traditional sprinkler's larger droplets, while also displacing oxygen near the fire's base, effectively suppressing many fires at a fraction of the water volume a conventional system would require, which matters enormously on a vessel where water damage itself can become a secondary safety problem. In practice, this system works. The overwhelming majority of fire incidents on modern cruise ships are detected early, contained within a single zone, and extinguished by the ship's own trained crew without ever requiring evacuation or significant damage beyond the immediate area of origin. Passengers on the rest of the ship, often just one deck away, may never even be aware an incident occurred. But here's the edge case that changed the rules industry-wide, and it's the one we opened with. On that 2006 voyage, the fire started on an open cabin balcony, an area explicitly excluded from the fixed detection and suppression requirements applied to the ship's interior. Investigators later determined the balcony partitions were made of polycarbonate and the deck tiles of polyurethane, materials that, while technically meeting the separate standards applied to external areas, burned extremely fast and produced thick, toxic black smoke when ignited. Once alight, high winds spread the fire rapidly along the exterior of the ship, climbing multiple decks before crew could physically reach and contain it, because the balcony's construction had never been evaluated against the same combustibility standards used inside the vessel. The fire itself never breached into the ship's interior fire zones. The interior containment system worked exactly as designed, but the smoke did. It entered adjacent cabins and corridors, and one passenger died from smoke inhalation, not from the flames themselves, while 13 others required treatment. The investigation's core finding was blunt. Balconies had been treated as outdoor space, not living space, and the fire protection rules simply hadn't caught up to how those spaces were actually being used, furnished, and lived in by passengers for hours every day. Within roughly 2 years, international maritime regulators amended SOLAS specifically to close this gap, requiring balcony partitions on new passenger ships to be non-combustible, restricting flammable furniture and materials on existing balconies unless fixed fire detection and suppression systems were retrofitted to cover them. This is the same pattern we've seen across nearly every major system on these ships. The rules exist because a specific, documented failure revealed exactly where the previous version of the system stopped protecting people, and every rule change afterward closes that precise gap rather than making some general improvement. So a fire on a cruise ship isn't really the chaotic ship-wide catastrophe most people picture. It's a contained zone-by-zone engineering problem, solved by steel boundaries, automatic doors, trained crews, and suppression systems, all built specifically because the ship itself has to be its own fire department for as long as it's at sea. And when that system has failed historically, it hasn't failed because the fire won. It's failed because smoke reached somewhere the system wasn't yet designed to protect. So the real question was never whether a cruise ship can catch fire. It's how quickly that fire gets boxed into a single zone before it can spread, and how many regulatory gaps, like the one that cost a life in 2006, have already been closed by the time you step on board today. But fire isn't the only invisible system engineered to contain a failure before it spreads through the entire ship. What happens when the danger isn't flame or smoke, but the ship's own electrical system failing all at once? I've broken that exact scenario down in another video.